Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about research. I know, it can be a really intimidating topic for a lot of folks, but it doesn't have to be. And in fact, research is a really important tool for people to have. Increasingly, parents want evidence sometimes of what we're saying is backed by research. Or we may just feel like we'd like to know more about a topic, and there's really good, solid information available in the research. But it does take the ability to pull out what's important and also what you can understand and leave the rest to the side. Because honestly, you really would have to have a PhD and a serious background in statistics to really be able to competently delve into the statistical analysis that's in most research studies. So we're going to talk today about how to avoid doing that, how to avoid having to understand what the statistical analysis says and instead pull out what you can hang on to and what does make sense so that you feel like you're a competent consumer of research. We're also going to look a little bit about how to search for studies. It's not that hard. There's so many great tools now available online. And then we're going to delve into what does the research say about behavioral sleep interventions. And we're going to talk mostly about that. What does the research say and kind of not say about sleep training, especially as it pertains to the first part of the first year. So let's dive in. Let's look first at what's in a research article. What are the parts of a research study as they get printed in or published in journals? So the first part here is the abstract, and the abstract contains really everything you need to know about that study. Abstracts are completely available. If you were to use Google Scholar or any of those other search engines, you're going to be able to see an abstract for just about any study you want to look at. Some of the really old ones may not have an abstract, and that's just a function of how it was. But anything I would say more recent than 1980 is going to have an abstract. The abstract is a summary of the entire study. So it'll have a little bit of a rationale, then it'll go into what they did, what they found, and even the discussion or kind of conclusion of the study. So most of the time, you're going to get what you need from an abstract. There might be times where you really want to delve a little bit more deeply into a study, and then you're going to want to see if you can locate it, read it, and all that. Now, if you do decide to locate a study, this first part they call the background or the literature review. Gives the reader the author's rationale, number one, for the question that they're trying to ask. And then they have to sort of show that they're building on existing research. So they tell you, here's the state of things right now, but here's what we don't know, and here's what we're going to do to answer that question. So you're also demonstrating to your reader that you've looked at what's existing already and that you're not just repeating something that's already been done, or you're not just making up a brand new idea, that you've actually built it on existing research. So after the lit review, and right here, is the end part of this particular lit review, you're going to dive into methods. And methods tells you how this study was constructed and conducted. So it's going to tell you every little detail, including how did they find their participants. That's usually this first part. So this says clients, but it can also say participants. Where did they find them? How many did they get? Who did they exclude? Because every study is going to say we want people with first-time parents with infants under a year. We don't want folks with twins. We don't want, there's going to be a list of things that get left out. They're going to talk about demographics. So sometimes this is really a good thing to read carefully. It's really important to know who a study was conducted on, just because that also tells you who it wasn't conducted on. Looking at demographics is really important. I can tell you, of course, that the vast majority of research is usually conducted on white populations and potentially white upper middle class populations. So what we know about certain phenomena in communities of color or a variety of different subgroups is not as good. So really paying attention to the demographics of a sample, and also across studies, right? It's not just one study, but the fact that a lot of studies are done on one specific group of people is really important to pay attention to. Then the next section is called measures, and this can also be called instrumentation. This tells you what did they use to assess or measure different phenomena. So the scales that they used. Did they, if they were going to measure maternal depression, what did they use? If they're going to measure sleep behavior, did they use actigraphy? So in this section, you may not know the difference between, for example, two different scales on depression. You might not be able to go, well, I wouldn't have used that one, right? But you can at least look at how outcomes were measured within a particular study. And we're going to talk later about how that can be problematic, just purely what they chose to measure. So it just depends on what you're looking for in a particular study. Then we're going to get into the results section. Oh, and there's also another section called procedure. And that basically says, okay, first we did this, and then we did this, and then the scales were given, and we did this intervention, and it lasted for 2 weeks, and then we did the next thing. So that also can be important to look at. Like, how long did the intervention last? Who did the intervention? Was it parents? What were parents doing to, record sleep behavior, whatever it is. Then you're going to come to the results section, which is usually the section we all freak out about because it's super hard to understand. So here's a little key for you, a little trick. I always skip the results section at first, and I go read the discussion section, because the discussion section is going to give you in narrative form information about what they found in results. So sometimes you can skip the results section altogether if you want and just read the discussion section. Sometimes I read the discussion section, get the gist of what they found, and then I go back to the results section and look at maybe some of their charts. I may not read the whole thing, just because it gets into some pretty hairy statistics that don't always make sense. We're going to talk a little bit later about the difference, though, between statistical significance and practical significance. So researchers are going to get very excited about statistical significance. That means that the statistical analysis, the test, the formulas that they ran on their data kicked out what they would consider a significant result. Statistical significance does not always equal practical significance. That's going to be a really key theme in what we talk about later, because there can be all kinds of ways that things come up significant in terms of the statistics, and then when you actually look at the difference in or change in behavior, not a lot, might not be a lot. So yeah, we come to the discussion section, and again, it's going to, in a narrative way, tell you what it was they found. The other idea about going to the discussion and then going back to the results is the discussion may make a big deal out of certain results, and then you can go back, like I said, and look at the charts and look at the differences, for example, between the two groups. Let's say you have an intervention group and a control group. The intervention group gets a sleep program and the control group gets nothing. And you're going to look at the difference in, say, night wakings between those two groups. You want to look and really look at the difference at the end between those two groups and see if it's actually different, if it actually makes sense to you. And then at the very end, we're going to see the references section. This can be helpful, especially if they mention something and they cite a study. You're going to go here and potentially look for that study. Though that's the kind of the layout of a research article. We're going to go in depth through the sleep research, and in that we're going to talk more about sort of methodology and how research studies get done. So there's different kinds of research. It's also important to understand what kind of research you're looking at, because different kinds of research have different purposes. So there are some published journal articles that are just literature reviews. That means that they give you an overview about what's currently known about a specific topic. They just go and they look at all the research on some topic and they say, here's everything or a lot of what we know right now. And those can be super not hard to read because there's no statistics in there, and B, they're just a gold mine of information. So if you can find a lit review on a certain topic, oh my goodness, you're gold. It's great. There are different kinds of lit reviews. Some are called systematic, and that means they have a certain rubric for selecting studies and reporting on them. Um, there was one not on sleep, but it was the effect of praise on children's motivation. And this was a systematic review because they organized it like, here's all the research that says praise is good. Here's all the research that says praise is not good. And then they drew conclusions. So that's systematic. A critical review, this one's systematic. Crying babies, tired mothers, what do we know? This is a systematic review that probably looked at the effect of having a fussy baby on maternal fatigue and depression. I did a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is from my own critical literature review, where I said, let's compare the research to what parents are told in sleep training books to see whether or not they support each other. So it had a sort of a critical lens on it in terms of like, does this match up? Does it not? The next, there's another kind of study that's like a literature review, but sort of definitely has statistics in it. It's called a meta-analysis, and this is like a lit review in that they're saying, okay, we're going to gather together all of these studies and we're going to summarize them, but they kind of summarize it statistically. So they'll say, across all of these different studies, what do we know about the effect of A on B? It can be a great source of information, so it really gives you a very broad view across a lot of studies. The statistics can be a little hairy to read. On those, I'd read the lit review portion, and then I'd definitely skip the results, and I'd read the conclusion so that you had a handle on it, because meta-analyses can be hard. So here's an example. Is sleep duration associated with childhood obesity? A systematic review and meta-analysis. So they kind of did both a review and then they looked at it statistically. So they took all the studies on children's sleep disruptions and later obesity and said, across all these studies, what do we know is the effect of one thing on another? Then we can have surveys. Surveys we love. Surveys are pretty easy to read. They can be what's called descriptive. That means they just tell us what's happening. What are parents reading about sleep? What are parents doing about sleep? Where they're not trying to prove anything. They're just saying, here's the situation. How much time are parents spending on their phone? By the way, that's called technoference now in the literature. Really interesting term. It's the idea of what happens when a parent's on their phone with a child present. Technoference. Survey can also be correlational. Like, what's the relationship between parental anxiety and sleep problems? Do those two things go together? And you can assess those through a survey. So is temperamental sensitivity predictive of lower success with sleep training? Same thing. So that survey measured sensitivity, infants' sensitivity, and then asked parents about their experiences with sleep training, and then statistically you see if those two things go together. A lot of what we're interested in are experiments. We all know what these are, right? Two groups. It looks at the effect of one thing, like the effect of a sleep intervention on nighttime sleep behavior, the effect of parental education on anxiety. Does that work? Essentially, an experiment asks, does such and such a thing work? Does it have an impact? Does extinction improve sleep better than no intervention at all? Content analysis, I'm not going to talk a lot about because you don't really read a lot, but I love it so much. It looks at the content in media for sort of meta messages. So what meta messages are people getting via television shows or book titles or parenting magazines or websites? What's the underlying sort of cultural messages? This is one I've always wanted to do. I would call it "Where's the Baby?" A content analysis of television characters with infants, right? How often do people on TV have a baby and you never see that baby, right? Okay, so how do I find research? I am not positive this is going to work on the way I've got this presentation set up. I'm going to try this. So let's just see what happens, everyone. Is it going to let me do it? No, it's not. Well, it might. Let's see. Let's see if it, oh, it does. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at is scholar.google.com. Here it is. It's literally only going to show you results from books and scholarly articles. So let's do maternal. Well, let's do technoference just for fun, and children, and just see what comes up. So this is what it's going to look like. Over here, we'll show you that if, for example, right here, the full text of this article is available online. Same thing, PDF. These link to full text. I have linked it to my Antioch University database, so you will not have this. But anything that says HTML or PDF, that means it's available right here online. If you wanted to say, ooh, this sounds interesting, you could click this. It would take you to where you could read the abstract. It will not give you, unless it's over here, this link will not give you full text. But you can always read the abstract from here. But the thing I like about Google Scholar is that this search bar, white noise, infant sleep, you can type in almost anything. And you get to see what's on there. So it's usually it's a very flexible search, ability to search a variety of things. So I love Google Scholar. That means everybody can search for research on their own. Oops. Sorry, there we go. I'm not going to show you these, but let me just mention them really fast. There are a variety of organizing tools. That means you can collect research and organize them and be able to search them for yourself. I love something called SciWheel. Well, should I show you this? I'll just show you really fast, you guys, because it really is such a great tool. And I think it's like $9, $10 a month. But I'll show you what it can do. I'll just show you my collection of references and why I love it so much. So here's my list. I've got projects over here. So I've got topics on temperament and sleep, and I was able to collect PDFs, but this will store the PDF. It'll store all the information on this article. If it will open the PDF, and then you can also highlight the PDF. It lets you annotate it. You can put it in different categories. It's just fantastic. The other neat thing it'll do is once you start collecting articles, it will give you suggestions of things that are sort of like some stuff that you already have. So this is a really fantastic tool, I think. And it's, like I said, it's just not that expensive. The other ones, these are some other ones that you might look into: Manderley, something called Noodle Tools, RefWorks. There's lots of them. But I do think if you want to start having your own little database, really getting an online one is a great option. Okay, so we're going to think critically about research. 4 areas to really look at carefully. One is the background or lit review. What's the premise of the research? Are they making assumptions or connections between concepts that you don't totally buy or agree with? It's good to pay attention to that. Look at the participants. That's where I said really look at the methods a little carefully. There's no statistics in the methods section. And you can just look at it and go, does that make sense to me? Um, Given what it is they're looking at. Look at who they included. Look carefully at age ranges. When we're talking about research on children, age ranges can be all over the place. We're going to talk later about how that really shows up. And then look at who was excluded. Again, this is going to come up later when we talk about the sleep research. Look, if they have an intervention, really look at the intervention and then really look at how that intervention was deployed. Especially when it's sleep research, it's really important how they gave parents the sleep intervention. Again, I'm sort of spoiler alert because we're going to be talking about it in a little bit. Then it's also super important to look at what did the control group get. So if they want to look at a sleep intervention, the intervention group got this great sleep intervention. What did the control group get? And does it make sense to you to compare those two things? And then outcome measures. What did they use as a measure of the intervention working, right? So they'll say, well, we wanted to test the effectiveness of this intervention on infant sleep, but what part of sleep? Was it night waking? Was it duration, longest bout of sleep? Was it sleep onset? They don't always look at all three of those things. The conclusion of the study may say, yay, this intervention worked, but you have to really ask, what did it work on specifically? And those are all things you can look at without any statistics at all. So here's a really good example. This is a famous, popular study. It gets cited all the time. The long-term mother and child mental health effects of a population-based infant sleep intervention, a cluster randomized controlled trial. You don't really have to worry about that, except randomized means they were randomly assigned to one of two groups and that there was a control group. That's usually the gold standard. They consider that the gold standard of research, randomized and a control group. So the objective was maternal depression is an established risk for adverse child development. 2/3 of clinically significant depressive symptoms occur in mothers reporting an infant sleep problem. So here they're linking infant sleep to maternal depression and not totally the other way around just yet. So here's their aim. We aim to determine the long-term effects of a behavioral intervention for infant sleep problems on maternal depression and parenting style. So those are the two outcomes, right? Does this sleep thing improve maternal depression and something about parenting style, as well as on child mental health and sleep when the children reach 2 years of age? Okay, fair enough. Now we know what it's about. So we conducted a cluster randomized trial in well child centers across 6 government areas of Australia. Participants were 328 mothers reporting an infant sleep problem at 7 months, drawn from a population sample. So they were drawn from this big sample that was recruited at 4 months. So they recruited a bunch of people at 4 months, and then at 7 months, they asked whose child had a sleep problem. We compared usual well child care, that's the control group, versus a brief behavior modification program designed to improve infant sleep, delivered by well child nurses at 8 to 10 months. So this behavior mod is extinction, which we're going to talk more about, delivered by the nurses, and then they measured mom's depression with the EPDS, which is a good scale, parenting practices, the parent behavior checklist, child mental health, the child behavior checklist, and maternal report of a sleep problem, yes or no. So I underlined a couple of things. One is that the measure of a sleep problem was basically mom saying that there was a sleep problem, which sometimes is fine, but we may say, well, how do we know that the child actually had a sleep problem? Maybe they didn't. We don't know why. And then the extinction was delivered by nurses, so not necessarily the parent. It's possible that the nurses did the intervention. And then they just assessed whether there was a sleep problem based on a simple yes or no, which also we could critique, like, is that good enough as a measure? So here's the results. At 2 years, mothers in the intervention group were less likely than control mothers to report clinical depression. Now, less likely, but if we look at these numbers, it was only 9% less. I'd have to reread this study to really decide whether I thought that was, I mean, it is better. It's better. Is it way better? It's a little hard to say. And then this is a different cut point. A total of 27.3% of children in the intervention group versus 32.6 had a sleep problem. So that's only about 5% better. Again, the study's going to say it improved infant sleep, but only by 5%. That's not really a lot. Um, and then it says sleep intervention in infancy resulted in sustained positive effects on maternal depression, found no evidence of longer term adverse effects on mothers' parenting practices or children's mental health. They don't really talk about sleep here on this thing, but it's just interesting to read this. And sometimes the conclusions feel like, wow, this thing was really amazing. And when you look at it or you look at how they measured it, the jury can be a little bit out. A lot of times they say there was no adverse effect on children's mental health because I'd have to relook at this. But for example, if we still didn't see a difference between the two groups in that whatever that one scale was, they'd say there was no negative effect. Again, I'm not quite sure how they would have identified a negative effect. We'd have to dig in and see what that was. Um, but that's just an example of just literally taking an abstract and starting to go, I wonder about that. I think I'm going to go look at that a little bit more carefully and when I read the study. It's not saying it was bad. It's just a point to go, I'm going to go look at that more carefully. So grab your critical thinking hat about research. It's important to consider, especially when we're talking about parents and babies and stuff, what's the simple effect of human contact? A lot of interventions for sleep are done within the context of a clinical or at least a consultation oriented context. And so the parent isn't just getting the intervention, they're getting the intervention plus a bunch of stuff. Not many studies factor in the helpful aspect of just human contact. And we all know that just support by itself helps parents a lot. So when you're mixing those two things together and then just saying the intervention was the thing that worked, it's a little not totally correct. So for example, it says this is an example from that same study. Subjects in the intervention group met with a nurse who, quote, gave a structured consultation sheet to elicit the nature of the sleep problem, identify solutions, and develop a written individualized sleep management plan with the mother on the basis of graduated extinction or adult fading. So that means they either could do some kind of Ferber, cry it out, or adult fading, which is basically like the sleep lady or the chair method approach, where you just gradually fade what you do. And they lumped both of those together. Plus, this to me sounds an awful lot like a coaching context, like a sleep coaching context. But then they said, hey, the intervention worked. The validity of self-report. You have to ask, is self-report always the only way to go, especially with sleep problems? Generally, we'd really like there to be some kind of objective measure of sleep improvement, not just that the parent says that the sleep is better. Now, a parent's report is super great and important. I mean, who else are you going to ask? But you have to say, they ask these mothers, do you think the intervention changed your relationship to your child at all? Well, you have to think, who's going to say yes, right? I don't think there's something called social desirability bias. You're not going to say, oh yeah, this thing I just did, I think I just wrecked my child. They're all going to say yes. So ideally you want an objective measure to balance out the self-report. And then what's called internal validity. That means, does this study measure what it says it's going to measure? And this is while the conclusion said that this is the first effectiveness randomized trial to report on the long-term effects of behavioral interventions for sleep problems, it really was testing contact by the nurses, since since the nurses were able to choose what intervention they deployed. So they said they were testing this intervention, but so much else happened around that intervention that I don't see how you can isolate the intervention by itself outside of that context. Super important. This goes for not only sleep research, but definitely all the research on therapy and therapeutic effects. Research tends to zero out the human component as like too tough to measure, so they just don't measure it. But that doesn't make it inactive or irrelevant. It's actually the most important part of any of those transactions. So it's a really important thing to bear in mind. Okay, so what does research say about sleep training in the first year? Huge disclaimer, huge disclaimer. I'm going to be talking a lot about the problems with the research on extinction or crying it out. This is not meant to say that crying it out is bad at all. Using crying and different versions of it are super effective for lots and lots and lots of people, and it happens without drama, and it works, and everybody's happier, and that's great. What I really have a problem with is, number one, the universality of this as the only approach, and also where it's gone in terms of how it's been taken from research and now adapted into popular parenting discourse and parenting advice. There are things that are said in the parenting books that are not at all based in the research. So it's really important for us to parse it out, to ask a better question, to say, who does it work for? Who does it not work for? And things like how much crying is too much crying, right? Nobody's asking those questions of the research. And I think that that's a huge problem. I think it's a huge problem. And I think parents are, a lot of parents are suffering because of it. So again, this is not an anti-crying talk at all. I just want us to really look critically at what the research actually says, and then where it's kind of gone off the rails when it comes to what we're actually telling parents. Okay, so we do know that sleep problems have serious consequences. No question. There are short-term problems, and now they're saying longer-term problems of broken sleep in infancy. I have a bit of a problem with some of the longer-term ideas because often the research silently assumes that this stuff will happen if nothing is done, right? If you just let sleep problems go. I also think that there are temperamental and regulatory factors that underlie both the sleep problems and the later issues that have nothing, they draw a straight line from sleep problems to obesity, sleep problems to ADHD. I think there's other stuff that informs both of those, but that's just me. Okay. So we know the sleep problems are bad. What does research say to do? Okay, this comes purely from behaviorism. Back in the 1920s, John Watson and others really saw infants as a blank slate who only they came into the world with nothing and only responded to what they learned from the outside world. So as a result, all of the foundational sleep research, all of it, and it's all pretty much the same set of studies that all of this is built on, is from that paradigm that whatever you pay attention to persists and whatever you ignore will go away. So 99.9% of the research that's out there looks at parental behavior as the driver of sleep problems, as the cause of sleep problems. And as a result, they say then that the solution is to fix parental behavior. So Blampede in France, these are two massive, Karen France is the leading researcher on extinction and really the primary, the original one. Says parental attention to distress reinforces and maintains crying and substitutes parent-related cues for the bed-related ones. If parental reinforcement is withheld, the distress behavior undergoes extinction. That's the concept behind all of the original sleep training information. Yeah, we're going to talk more about that. Okay, so infant sleep research considers one, parental behavior as the leading driver of sleep problems, and two, that the infant as the infant as malleable, right? The infant is eminently trainable by withholding this kind of withholding reinforcement or soothing in those times of distress. So the important point that I actually just mentioned a few minutes ago, that a purely behavioral perspective does not consider any individual or systemic influences to be relevant at all. So the pure extinction research does not even consider temperament or physical health or development or feeding status or any of that, or parental values. They just say it's all about behavior, and we're just going to focus on behavior. And the reason that they don't consider it is all those moving parts it just makes it harder to research. Systemic research is extremely difficult to do, and really a lot of times it's way easier for them to just go purely towards behavior. So here are the current interventions in research and the terms used for that. The first kind is called pure extinction. We call it, cold turkey. That's where you put the baby in the bed, you close the door, you don't go until morning. They'd soon discovered early on that parents really hated that. And so researchers came up with what they called a gentler approach, which was graduated extinction. That's Ferberizing, controlled crying, all those different terms where parents can go in at varying intervals. Graduated means lengthening. There's time checks, which is exactly the same interval. That's all the same thing, pretty much the same idea. We know what this is. There's another kind. This one's super confusing in the research. I can't even, for as precise as research is supposed to be, I don't quite get how this one can be so incredibly muddy. But it's called extinction with parental presence, or camping out. Now, this is the weird one, because the real version of camping out is pure extinction with the parent in the room. So basically the parent sleeps on a mattress, the baby cries and cries and cries, the parent does not respond, but the parent is there. That's the real definition of it. They can also throw in there the parental fading, which is the parent does what they were doing before to soothe the baby, and then they just back that off over time. To me, those sound like two completely separate ideas and approaches, but in research, they often throw those two in the same bin, and I don't quite. I'd love to ask somebody because I don't quite get it. Then here are some other interventions. Bedtime fading, we may all know, which is if a kid has taken a million years to go to sleep, you move their bedtime to the time where they naturally fall or have been naturally falling asleep, get them to fall asleep easy, and then you back bedtime earlier and earlier. Then the fading approach can be called parental fading, or something called stimulus fading, which is what I mentioned already. You're doing what you do, and then you just do less of it over time. And then a lot of the prevention research is called a behavioral package, and goodness knows what that even is. That can be a hodgepodge of things. Often it will be getting the sleep timing right, ruling out other factors, having a good routine. But often in the research, it's super vague about what they actually say. They'll say mothers were given information on sleep and feeding routines, on the importance of good naps, and on appropriate responses to night waking. And they never say what that is. So it's really difficult to know what information they're actually giving parents. Okay, so why is research so hot on extinction? What do they say about it? They say it's quick, it's easy for parents to understand, it's effective, and it's without negative side effects. So quick, some research said it only takes a week. This is another one, that it's easy for parents to understand. Basically, they're basically saying if you give parents too many steps, too much detail, they won't be able to follow it, that you have to give them something super clear and super sort of monolithic, because then they can understand it and be consistent. Effective, they just say it over and over and over and over and over and over again, that it's effective. I mean, enough already, right? Yes, we know it works. And then this is said constantly too, that no study has ever found any negative side effects to the use of extinction. And you'll see these four ideas repeated a lot. I mean, this is so considered so well established that people don't even, they don't have to keep proving it. So a lot of this research is older. The foundational research was all done in the 80s and 90s and just basically is keeps. This is what happens in research, right? Something gets documented and it gets documented and recited so intensely that it becomes sort of unassailable. It's just like it just is a fact. And the stuff about extinction is definitely that way, I feel. The reported benefits, they say it improves parental sleep, it decreases stress, better daytime behavior in the child. Karen France did stuff, says it increases child likability and agreeableness, improvements in the mother's perceived control of the child. In fact, all these practice, now they've done lit reviews and systematic reviews, and now it's kind of codified into practice recommendations. So for pediatricians, they get these practice recommendations. What do you do for infant sleep problems? Extinction. And they'll generally say pure extinction is the most well established, but that parents can't do it. So it's like, well, if parents can't do it, then graduated extinction. And it's really ensconced in kind of a vault of research knowledge. So yeah, because of the number of studies, it's considered the only approach, not because it's better, but simply because it's the most researched. So that's another problem with research, is it's not the best, it's just that it's the most researched, which we can say, why? Why aren't other things looked at? So here's a little, we're going to start deconstructing some stuff. So let's look at it's quick. Pure extinction is considered quick. It's considered to only take 3 days. But that's 3 days of pure crying, right? But some studies found, and a lot of studies that I looked at the duration of the intervention and how many wakings there were at the end of the intervention. This seminal study found that for them, they said some professionals have suggested the problem will abate in 3 to 4 days. However, their present study indicated that it took 3 weeks or more before the awakening and crying were reduced to less than 4 per week. And these guys were using, extinction. So 3 to 4 weeks, which is way different than what books are saying. And the studies that I looked at, children were still waking weeks into the study. So again, we have to remember that in studies, they're just looking for improvement in sleep behavior, not total resolution. They just want sleep to improve, which is interesting. Yeah, some research side-eye. It's necessary. Researchers suggest that sleep problems in early infancy persists long term, assuming nothing is done. But they also will say, it's well established that across studies, they say about 20 to 25% of infants have a sleep problem. And that means about 75% don't. But we're recommending sleep interventions for 100% of infants. Like we're telling parents, if you don't sleep train, your child will have a sleep problem. And there's really no evidence. There's no research on that point at all. Easy to understand. I already explained this, that this is a quote from Eckerberg study. The advice given was very specific and authoritative, presenting no alternative methods. Most parents had tried many different methods to make the child sleep through the night before seeking help, resulting in low self-esteem. This concept implies that parents may be incapable of choosing between different treatment alternatives. So yeah, I don't know what to think about that. Okay, so effectiveness is another really important area that we want to look at super carefully. What does effective mean? So some studies found no difference between intervention and control groups at follow-up. So here's the deal. They do an intervention for a certain period of time, then they take an assessment and they say, yeah, this was different. And then they'll go months, maybe a couple of months down the road, and they'll test again. So in several of these pretty pivotal studies, there was a difference at the end of the intervention and then no difference by 2 months later, meaning that it didn't last, or parents couldn't stick it out outside of the holding that takes place in a research study. In a recent randomized control trial, remember one of those great big ones, found only a 1% difference between the intervention and the control group in terms of how many infants were still waking twice per night. Again, statistically, there might have been a difference. If you look at the actual numbers, only 1% more, which is interesting. I think it's really interesting. If you told parents you'll have a 1% chance that your kid's sleep will be better if you do crying it out, parents are going to be like, no, I don't want to. Yeah. Okay. So this is just examples of all of this, many studies that showed only small differences at the end. So this one, Adams and Reichert, at the follow-ups, the graduate extinction group still had 15 to 20 minutes of crying. In this one's, children were still waking twice a night. This one, at the 3-month follow-up, children were still waking an average of once per night for almost 20 minutes. And they only slept 27 minutes longer because they were awake less time at each wake up. So it's important when you go look at some of these studies to look at the actual differences in sleep behavior. And then you decide if you feel like that's a solid piece of evidence for improvement. Some might have big improvement, but not all of them. And certainly not the ones where they say, yay, this shows that this worked. It's not working in the way that parents would think it's working, for sure. Parents' expectations or what parents are told to expect can be way different than what the research actually finds. So hold on to your critical thinking hats, because across almost all the studies, extinction did not work for between 25 and 50% of the sample. Didn't work. So remember that research deals in averages. They deal in the mean of the group. That doesn't mean everybody had the same level of success. It means there's a fairly large chunk of every sample for whom sleep did not improve at all. This is important because it's not about saying, well, let's ditch the intervention. Not at all. But advice doesn't have any space in it currently that this might not work for you. And that's a big group of people within those contexts of research where they're getting a lot of support and everything. Extinction didn't work for everybody. So I don't know why we're giving parents the message that if you just do it right, it will work for you. So we have to also look at what actually improved in these studies. Sometimes it was not the sleep. A lot of times it was the parent's perception of the sleep problem, which I don't know, you could say that's just as important. If a parent really feels better about it, yeah, I mean, hey, that's awesome. So a meta-analysis concluded, so the highest level of research evidence is a meta-analysis, concluded that psychosocial sleep interventions appear to impact the amount of sleep that a mother reports her baby to have, although the infants continued to wake just as frequently. In some studies, there was a big difference between what parents reported as wakings and what, like the little actigraph. The actigraph is like a little machine that a baby wears on their ankle. The baby's sleep behavior didn't change at all. The parents' perception of the sleep behavior changed. Sometimes interventions affected total nighttime sleep, but not awakenings. So the baby still woke up 3 times. They just woke up for less time at each awakening. I don't know about you, but as a parent, I would still be quite frustrated about the 3 awakenings, even if they were short. So effect on the duration of nighttime sleep is generally small. And then what really improves? Even this guy Eckerberg says it's likely that mood improvements made parents more accepting of their children's behavior and rated it more favorably after the interventions. So we have to think about what, are sleep interventions actually improving sleep in research or something else? And then what part of the intervention was the active ingredient? So there's a big difference between how the information gets deployed in a research study and parents actually taking it home. right? So that's called, I think it might even be the next slide. That's called transportability, right? How well does it translate from a research setting into the real world? In the research setting, these parents are getting a lot of holding. Um, this is probably spoiler alert, but in a bunch of these, it was done in an inpatient setting. So there are, in like Australia, there are sleep clinics where moms and a baby can go. The mom gets a lot of support, mental health interventions, meals brought to her. In one of these studies, the nurse took the baby and did the sleep training. I don't see how you can compare that to a parent at home with a book, right? Those are two completely separate um, conditions. So it's really important to understand that research really is a whole different world. And yet they point to the intervention as being the successful part of it. So another disclaimer, because we're going to be looking at crying and how they measured negative impact. This is another disclaimer. This is not about that all crying is traumatic. Absolutely not. I don't think that. But again, we're comparing what the research says and what we know about crying from the research. So it's super important to know, what does the research say and how did they measure it? So only 11 studies have ever looked at any effects on the child. Here is how the effects are typically assessed. These are the measures. And this is, remember how I said sometimes it's important to know what the measures are? This first one is called the Flint Infant Security Scale. The main study showing no negative effects was done by Karen France in 1996. And she was measuring whether there were emotional negative outcomes from using extinction. And she used this thing called the Flint Infant Security Scale, which was created in 1974 to measure security. Now, in the 70s, that's when attachment as a theory was really, they were just starting to think about how to assess attachment. And back then they called it security. So this woman created this scale trying to get at security. But the questions, when you look at the infant security scale, are things that to me speak more to aspects of temperament or something else that's not security at all. So some of the questions are things like accepts new foods readily, will allow a stranger to change the diaper, likes rough play. Like I I don't see how that measures emotional effects or emotional security. That all sounds to me like a development, because it depends on if the child has stranger anxiety and some temperament attributes. But that Flint Infant Security Scale has been used over and over and over again to measure whether a child had some kind of repercussions from extinction. And then parent report a lot. So we talk about social desirability bias, which means if you ask a parent after they've just done extinction, hey, do you think you harmed your baby? What are they going to say? Are they going to be able to say yes? Or, I mean, it's not like there would be harm, but asking a parent is not always the only way it should go. Plus, a parent who might have gotten some more sleep is automatically going to view everything more positively. So again, we can't just rely on parent report. And then there's the child behavior checklist, which generally is for older kids, and they're looking for like, oh, did the kids who went through extinction have behavioral problems? The CBCL is a really great measure. I don't really have a problem with it. I just don't, sometimes I feel like the way they look for negative effects is like looking for something you don't want to find, right? It's like, no, I have no idea. Where is it? Nope, it's not over here, right? It's like, it's not always super nuanced. There are some decent studies, but not very many, I have to say. So yeah, I just already said this. So France in 1992. I do want you to note the age range of these kiddos, 6 to 24 months. Karen France definitely says extinction should never be used with babies under 6 months. And she said, and even then, only with a lot of support and guidance and monitoring, which is interesting. Here's the other problem with most of these studies that on negative side effects. They almost never say how much crying actually happened. So if you say we put these kids through extinction and we didn't find any negative effects, that's fine, but did all these babies cry 15 minutes? Okay, then we know that 15 minutes of crying didn't have an effect. Were they crying for an hour? Okay, then an hour didn't have an effect, but we have no idea. Most of these studies never tell us how long infants were crying, most of them. And then her results showed an improved likability, which I don't know, gives me the willies a little bit. And agreeableness. They showed improvements in likability and agreeableness, but when you look at the raw scores, there was only a 1 point difference. So again, it was not a big change between the two groups. Okay, I already said all this. Cool. So, like I said, the investigation of negative effects lacks specificity. Most of the time, they don't say how much infants were crying and at what ages. So what we can gather from the research that's out there is crying was not harmful in the way they measured it, in the subjects they included in their sample, and who cried for an unspecified amount of time. For me, given development and the differences in development, as well as the effects by temperament and plus age, it's really important to know, like at this age with this amount of crying, there were no impacts. At this age with this amount of crying, there were no impacts. Ooh, babies of this age with that amount of crying, that wasn't good. We have no idea about that. We got to a point where it's so ensconced that extinction doesn't cause harm that nobody's asking other questions anymore. So we do know that at certain developmental stages, limited crying is totally benign, not a problem, but it can't be said for all babies at all stages in all contexts. Stress at certain periods of brain development can cause disruption for some babies. And for sensitive infants, stress that could be handled, this is Alan Shore, stress that could be handled by a mellower infant could be disorganized. So again, we really need to do some more fine-grained research on how much crying is too much, how much is fine. I said that enough. Okay. Research also overlooks the effect of temperament. And as you probably know, my area of work says that temperament is everything when it comes to sleep. And kiddos who are more intense and less adaptable are going to be the ones crying for longer periods of time. Research doesn't technically take temperament into account. So we actually don't know if that 25 to 50% of people for whom extinction didn't work were all had intense, alert babies. It's possible. We'll just never know. Okay, so let's go because I want to keep really moving. So what does parenting advice say? So now we know that there's like a little bit of a mixed bag with research. So now let's compare that to what parents are being told in books. Sleep books and programs, and I'm going to include some of the online programs, Taking Care of Babies, Moms on Call. Sleep issues have scary consequences. Boy, we scare parents to death. Sleep training is absolutely necessary to prevent these horrible consequences. Using some form of extinction is the best, most evidence-based approach, and it's been shown to be fast, effective, and without side effect. And plus, you have to start early to prevent bad habits, or else it will be harder, if not impossible, to do later. So let's look at, here's just a quick and dirty comparison of some of the best-selling sleep books. This is only a few of them. There are lots out there. So this is Weissbluth. Weissbluth says to start extinction with pure extinction at a 45-minute cap as early as 6 weeks. 3 to 4 months, you can use cold turkey, and he says it's going to work in 4 nights. Precious Little Sleep says to start at 2 or 3 months with a gradual fuss it out 10-minute time checks. Also at 3 to 4 months, pure extinction. Baby Sleep Solution. This is the book that used to be called 12 Hours Sleep by 12 Weeks. This is mostly about stretching feeds. So their program isn't necessarily about crying necessarily, but it looks like 8 to 12 weeks, a very brief wait before responding. And she says the baby should stay in the crib for a full 12 hours by this age. Taking Care of Babies says to start at 3 months, start with the lowest intervention and move up to a feed, and then by 5 months do graduated extinction, promises that it'll work in 7 to 14 days. Moms on Call, they have a book, but it's mostly, I think, an online program. They say that at 2 weeks, start at graduated extinction, and by 3 months, cold turkey. Baby should stay in the crib, no swaddle for a full 12 hours. And then this is another one super worrying to me. This is a major pediatric practice, and it's right on their website. You can see it for yourself. At 8 weeks, put the baby in the bed, close the door, don't go until morning. I know, I just can't. It's hard for me to even talk about. Okay, so what does the research say about using extinction before 6 months? I should have had cricket sound cues there. Yeah, it says almost nothing. So this is from my research. I've updated it with more recent studies. This is research using pure extinction, and these are the sample age ranges. So here's 12 months, here's 6 months. I want to highlight these two that do show pure extinction under 6 months, but these little diamonds are the mean or the average of the group. This one doesn't have it because this one says children under 60 months. It does not even say how many infants are in the sample, and same with this one. They don't even say whether there are babies under 6 months in the sample. So even though it says under 60 months, we don't know if there's any babies in there. Every other one is 6 months and up, and a lot of them are really older, more like 9 months. You can see this. That's more like 9 months and up. That's pure extinction. Yeah, I already said that. Okay, here's graduated extinction. Now there's more in the under a year range, but if you look still at under 6 months, there are very few, and ones like this one is like 3 weeks to 3 years, or four. One of these is 4 to 5. This one 4 to 52 months. This one looks like it's 4 months to 42 months. That's a huge age range. And none of these studies parcel out the effects by age. It'll just say sleep improved across the whole sample. But we really don't know anything about what the babies in those samples did. And these ones under 6 months are, well, Eckerberg is inpatient. These two are definitely the inpatient studies. There's this one that used like 5-month-olds. This one that used birth to a year, I think. But if you just go down here, there's almost nothing under 6 months. That means we know very, very little about using extinction with babies younger than 6 months, despite the fact that almost all the advice says to start at 3 or 4 months. Yeah, wide sample age ranges. Sometimes there's vague definitions, like I said before, wait a short time, but they don't say what that means. The other thing is that research, when they are doing in the studies that are looking at younger babies, they're often trying to, it's usually with a goal of prevention. If they use any delay that they talk about, it's very, very brief. They're not talking about 20, 45 minutes, an hour, or pure extinction. So it's very different in research from what the books say. Yeah, I'm going to skip that. Okay, so no studies have compared the efficacy or the effects of behavioral interventions instituted at different ages. So this idea that if you do it at 3 months, you'll prevent sleep problems later, or if you do it at 3 months, it'll be easier than if you wait to start at 6 months. There's literally no research on that at all. It is totally made up. The other thing is in prevention studies, no studies have looked at whether effects last past a few months. Some of the prevention studies, the effects faded. So if they instituted it at 3 months, by 4 months, there was really no effect. So a meta-analysis says there's insufficient evidence about what type of intervention is the most effective at which ages. So there's a huge disconnect between the research and advice. In terms of the meta-analysis, again, effect size, meaning how strong was the effect or the efficacy, saying that there's no evidence showing that preventive interventions reduced mother-reported night waking. It just didn't work. So then again, we have to say, why are we telling parents to do something that we're not entirely sure works? So this is just more saying that really the research on prevention is spotty at best. So the question is, why are we having parents start so early? The other important thing is parents don't like using crying it out. Again, for some parents, they're ready for it. It works without a lot of stress. They do it at 3 months or 4 months or whenever. It's 1 or 2 or maybe 3 nights of really tolerable, mild fussing, and it's over and it stays that way. And boy, honestly, have a party. That's awesome. Um, but it's not that way for a lot of parents, and certainly most of the ones that I end up talking to. The idea is, why do we have to talk parents into doing something? Why can't we give them alternatives? And there are alternatives. So we know that extinction might not work for everybody. Um, we don't know that any amount of crying is perfectly benign. So I usually say, calm that baby down. We don't really need kiddos to get disorganized. Um, Behavioral approaches have to be used with an awareness of the contextual aspects of sleep, what we all do every day, which is all the context of sleep. Because if it wasn't about the context, people could use a book and experience success, because then it's just an intervention that you're deploying. But what coaches do and those who work with parents is we're considering everything that impacts sleep, and that really is what needs to happen. Also, parents with a temperamentally more sensitive, intense child, they need a different approach than crying it out, because it doesn't always work. We do know that alternative methods work. Maternal or parental emotional availability at bedtime has been shown to improve sleep and reduce cortisol, reduces stress for everybody. Also, response-based gradual approaches result in better sleep. There's a study, hopefully, that's going to come out soon that shows that sort of a more gradual, responsive approach where parents get to kind of be with the child reduces stress for everybody, and parents just feel better about having to do it. So all of these also have been shown in the research to work. They just don't get as much press. So parental fading, scheduled awakenings, white noise, a sleep diary, a bedtime routine. And it's important to note that no intervention has been shown to work better than any other. So really, it's about giving parents something that they feel good about and having them just do that. I think that the advice that's out there has made parents way more anxious about sleep, and way more doubtful of their own abilities to solve the problem. And what happens then is parents are just jumping ship too soon because they don't trust that they're doing the right thing or that they know what to do. And I place some of that blame on the advice that's out there and the tone of it that focuses so exclusively on behavior. Because when we focus on behavior, that means that when it doesn't work, it's the parent's fault, and that we all know that that's also not super true. So we also have to know that support all by itself improves sleep. So just sitting with a parent is going to help them an awful lot. So our relationship with parents has its own kind of impact that I wish there was more research on. There should be. Maybe we should do that. Okay, I'm actually going to stop now because that was a lot of information. I sure hope this has been helpful and illuminating, and I hope you all have lots and lots of questions because I will be ready to answer them. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you all soon.